Okay, so good morning, everyone. This is the October 6th, I'm told, uh, rendition of the Kubernetes community meeting. And we have a relatively short agenda this week, but I think as we often do, we will find that people want to talk about some things. So we will see where it goes. I know we have a demo this morning from Michael Michaels of Apprenda. And then I know we have a few SIG reports, one of which is time bounded. So after the demo, I'm going to jump to the SIG network report to make sure that we have time for Dan to make his next commitment. So we'll do that, and then we will go through a couple of other SIG reports about what's going on with the 1.5 planning and some notices and asking and answering questions as we always do. So let me introduce Michael from Apprenda to talk about what's going on in the world of Kubernetes and Windows. So take it away, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. So basically part of the SIG Windows team that includes G2 from Apprenda, Alex also from Apprenda, and a few other folks like Cesar from Red Hat and Alessandro from Cloudbase. And the SIG Windows has been working on integrating Windows Server containers with Kubernetes. We'll show a couple of quick slides. We'll show a couple of quick slides here, and then we'll move directly into a demo. Our main goal into bringing Windows Server containers into Kubernetes was to expand the ecosystem here and make Kubernetes the best cross-platform cluster manager out there. That it will allow us to leverage a lot of the investments into Windows Server containers and run a lot of the Windows-based applications into Kubernetes. In terms of the architecture, we haven't changed anything on kubelet. We haven't changed anything on the Kubernetes master components, and most of our work has centralized around the Windows Server node and the kubelet, as well as the kubeproxy components. We made a few changes on each of them, primarily a lot of changes on the networking side to accommodate some of the functionality gaps between Linux and Windows Server. I'll go into a couple of those in detail in a little bit, but the architecture looks essentially like this. So you have the infra container within the pod, you have one or more containers running in that, you have Docker running on Windows, and the node itself is running on Windows Server 2016. So with Windows Server containers, now our customers will be able to use IIS, ASP.NET, .NET Core, and any other Windows-based application into that container. We have an existing work in progress pull request that's available, and we'll share the slides if you guys want to go there and review it. And the SIG Windows team is working on improving that and enhancing that. So every week or so, we're adding new features. So when you look at the kind of networking design, which is where we spend most of our time, container mode networking, or the ability for containers to talk to each other over local host within a pod, does not exist on Windows. That's a communicated feature that we're pushing Microsoft as well as Docker to create for us. So that doesn't allow us to achieve a lot of the parity between the Windows pod abstraction as well as the Linux pod abstraction. And the second main thing that's missing is there's no SDN plugins on Windows. So we're working with Microsoft to see how we can make that happen. But essentially, this has forced us to use NetSH and the port proxy and routing table manipulation to achieve some of the networking abilities of Kubernetes and the ability for us to scale our containers and do the proper routing. All right, let's dive into the demo. So in the demo, very high level, we'll have two Windows Server 2016 nodes, one Linux node with the Kubernetes core components, and then we're going to use the guestbook Go application that's published with the Linux Kubernetes distribution to show you how that can run also on Windows. So let me switch my screens here really quickly. All right, so excuse me for a second, I need to exit the presentation mode here so I can minimize this guy. All right, so where we our infrastructure in this case is running on Windows Azure. So we have a set of nodes here. We have the 3 virtual machines I mentioned. We have the KubeLin01, which is a Linux virtual machine, and we have 2 Windows virtual machines. We have our networking adapters that are basically attached to the VMs. We have 2 Ethernet adapters per Windows host and 1 each on the Linux host. We have our virtual network that spans all of the virtual machines running on Azure, as well as the routing table that allows us to do a lot of the routing manipulation. So routing, if you use virtual machines within your private network, then you can do a lot of the routing on VMs. In Windows Azure, we had to create a routing table that would allow us to control the traffic flow. So let's switch here to Kubernetes, and let's go ahead and see what our infrastructure looks like here. So we get to see our nodes. So we have 3 nodes here, the 10.0.1.10, that's a Windows node. The .12 is also a Windows node. And the last one is a Linux node. So we have set up a lot of the environment variables that allow all of these nodes to talk to each other. We've started the kubeproxy as well as the kubelet on the Windows node. So let's go ahead and describe the Windows node here and see what that looks like. Notice here that the operating system is Windows, and all of the rest of the settings are very familiar to you guys that have been using Kubernetes. So we essentially we're able to inject into Kubernetes the ability to run and have Windows here as its OS. So let's go ahead and get pods here and see what kind of pods we have. So I only have, I don't have any running pods right now. So let's go ahead and create our Redis master controller that would allow me to show you guys the Guestbook Go application running on Windows. So go ahead and create our controller. Let me go ahead and create the service as well. And let's look at what this controller looks like. So this is a standard replication controller. And one of the main things that we want to target here is that the node selector is targeting the Windows tag. And that's exactly earlier when I described my node, I showed you guys that that's a Windows node. Let's go ahead and create our slave controller as well and create our slave service. And then run get pods to see. So I've created 2 instances of my slave, and I have 1 instance of my master. So the containers are creating right now. So we'll give them a couple of seconds here for them to get created. So I already have 1 of my slaves running. So now if I go ahead and look at some of the logs that are coming out of the Redis master, I'll be able to see if that's connected properly with the slave. All right, so we haven't had a connection yet, but that's gonna go ahead and happen within the next few seconds. Now, a couple of notes here. So because of some of the limitations of Windows and how we've implemented these apps, the apps themselves, the way they communicate is they're using labels to be able to go and find each other and the different components of the multi-tier application that they're using. So the networking in this case is a flat layer 3 networking. So, and we're using NetSH, like I said earlier, to do our port forwarding. So the service discovery in this case is happening through the environment variables. Go ahead and see if, all right, so there's full resync requested by the slaves, so ready to accept connections, and it seems like we should be able to be good to go since the synchronization of the slave has happened. So let me go ahead now and create my actual Guestbook application. I'll go ahead and create a controller and create our service here. In this particular instance, the service itself is using from the Go application, the Guestbook one, we are writing to the master, but we're reading from the slave. So that's kind of the implementation that we've used here. So let me go ahead and look at all our details here, and you can see here that the node that some of these pods are running is the Windows nodes with the .10 and .12 IP address. And we already have our guestbook application running. So let's go ahead and describe the service here so you can see the endpoints. So, so we have our guestbook. The IP address is 10.0.0.194 and the port is 3000. So let me go ahead and switch on my Windows node so I can show you a few things and also be able to access this application. So this is my Windows node. On the left side, I have the kubelet running. On the right side, I have the kubeproxy. Now, both of these are like executables that we instantiated and run on demand. In the future, SIG Windows is making more changes into the code. We'll make them into Windows services that will be auto-started anytime your node starts up. So let me open up Firefox here. All right, I guess something happened with Firefox on that node. Let's go to the other node and open up Firefox. And our application was on port 3000. Oops. And here's our guestbook application. So I'm going to put a couple of notes here. So it's K8's demo community 1. And go ahead and submit the second one. So we have a guestbook application running. So if we were to look at the environment variables here, so you see that these are Windows-specific environment variables, including some of the Kubernetes-specific, as well as the Redis-specific environment variables are created that will allow the Go application to find the Redis components. And we can also look at some of the information very specific to the Redis server. Now, let's go ahead and scale our guestbook application to 3 replicas. And in this case, we'll be taking advantage of all of the capabilities of Kubernetes. So just by incorporating the Windows Server containers into the mix, we're able to utilize the replication controller and get all the benefits like high availability, scaling, load balancing that you would expect to get as part of Kubernetes. So let's get our pods here and make sure that our new pods got created here. So yes, we do have 3 guestbook application pods. So now most of them are running on 10.12. So if I go to the second node here and open up and do a Docker PS here, you notice that we have multiple guestbook images running. And you also see the Apprenda pods. That's the infrastructure container that ships with each one of my pods. So let's go ahead and run a script here and see what will happen if I've demonstrated a bunch of connections to my application to showcase the load balancing across the 3 pods that I created. So going back here, my node is 10.0.0.194. And that's on port 3000. So I can go ahead and run my script here. And over here, you're seeing the 2 entries, community 1 and community 2 that I entered, but you're also seeing the load balancing across each one of my container IPs across the board. So we'll show you guys how we were able to not just get applications running on Docker, on top of Windows Server containers, but we also taking advantages a lot of the built-in benefits of Kubernetes and making them and transferring them and making them available to the Windows side. So going back to my slides here, the next steps from a community perspective are, we want more volunteers to come and try Windows Server containers, try our work, file some bugs. We have published our sample applications. We publish instructions on how to get Windows Server for Kubernetes. In the meantime, while that's happening, the SIG will continue to push for improvements in container networking with Microsoft. That includes everything from native overlay networking, the container mode networking for the ability to talk over local host, as well as DNS server support that was just added lately. So now we just have to incorporate that back into our code. The SIG will continue to work on this with a goal to bring into beta at version 1.5 of Kubernetes the work that we're doing with Windows Server containers. That's it from me.
Thank you, Michael. And we have a little bit more of an update from you later about any specific work around 1.5 if you want time. If you've covered that now, we don't have to do that.
Yeah, we don't have, I mean, the work that I demoed you right now, including DNS storage volumes and cAdvisor is probably going to be part of our beta. cAdvisor is probably a stretch goal for us, but the rest of the things are things that we're going to have as part of the beta roadmap that we have.
Awesome, thank you. And all of the information about participating in SIG Windows is in the README file in Kubernetes community on GitHub, right?
That is correct.
Fantastic.
Can we ask any questions, Sarah, or are we out of time?
Let's do a couple of questions. Let's do it, Bob.
So my question is, and if I missed it here in your flow, I apologize, but I mean, I think the natural thing to want to do is to run a cluster that's a mix of Linux containers, Windows containers, and I was curious if that's kind of the direct, like, what's the thinking around that in perhaps the 1.5 or the initial time frame, or is the idea to kind of have clusters be kind of exclusively one or the other?
I think that being a mix is entirely our goal. So we do believe that our customers are going to have both a distribution of Linux-based as well as Windows-based applications, and our goal is to complete this work in such a way that a customer can have a hybrid environment of Windows and Linux, and he can run containers on either one of the two OSs. More importantly, we will allow them, and we just didn't demo it today, but you can have an application or a service in this case that has 2 pods on Windows and 2 pods on Linux. Like the Redis replication controller can run on Linux, and you can have the Guestbook Go application run on Windows.
Yeah, so I believe it already works in that fashion as you're asking.
It looks like we also have a note that says the pod-to-pod networking setup requires RRAs, which is a server feature.
That is correct.
Okay. Ehor also asks, will it work on non-server? Oh, that was the answer to Ehor's question. Got it. Haha, this is going backwards. Okay, any other questions about the SIG Windows work right now? Okay, so there has been some discussion about a SIG Azure, which is different, making sure that Azure is a first-class cloud provider for Kubernetes as well. So I think there's an open chat on Kubernetes Dev about that. To be honest, I have not Kubernetes Dev closely this week, so I don't know if that's moved forward, but if people have interest in it, please go find that and see what your thoughts are and add and contribute to that discussion.
Yeah, so I actually do want to put a quick note on that. So when we did our work here, we did it on an on-premises infrastructure, and then we're porting everything into Azure. So we did encounter some difficulties. So G2 and Alex and folks from the SIG Windows have done a lot of the work to make it possible to run Kubernetes on Azure, and they've documented a lot of those steps. So if anybody's trying these things, come to SIG Windows, ask questions, and we'll help you get started.
Awesome. Do you think that there's reason to have two separate special interest groups, or have you done enough of this work that it seems like SIG Windows could cover running on Azure as well?
I think we probably can accommodate both of the interest groups in this case.
Okay. If you could follow up on that thread that I mentioned, and if you need me to find it, I will. But I just want to make sure that we're not creating new special interest groups where the charters are too overlapping, because we've already referred to some of this as SIG sprawl. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that without being thoughtful about it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll follow up. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks much, Michael. All right, so speaking of SIGs, we're going to go on and talk about SIG networking. So Dan, I know you have all sorts of fun stuff going on in SIG network. So are you game to tell us what's up in 1.5 and where you need help?
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So the top two things that I think we are have been working on and are discussing right now, before I get to the 1.5 specific stuff, are around network policy. That's probably a term a lot of people have heard related to some of the work that we've been doing. But what that basically is an alpha proposal based on pod ingress filtering right now. And that's been going on for the last 8 or so months or 9 months. And when we talk about ingress, we're actually talking about, like I said, pod ingress. So there's lots of different meanings for the term ingress, but we're talking specifically about pod ingress for network traffic as opposed to like cluster ingress or other things like that. And so we developed a proposal and a specification for how a Kubernetes resource or object should look to describe all of the ways that you can classify and restrict or allow ingress to the pod. And that, like I said, is currently an alpha proposal. You can see that in the Kubernetes repo and docs proposals. And it's currently being implemented by a couple of different networking plugin vendors. We want a couple of good implementations before we actually propose it for beta or GA, just so that we can make sure that we shake out any of missing pieces or things that don't work quite well, that sort of thing. So, I mean, that seems to be going pretty well right now. Like I said, it's basically being implemented. We haven't had a ton of discussion on network policy in the last couple of SIG meetings because, people are basically just heads down implementing it. And when we get more feedback in the next couple of weeks, then we'll attempt to make a decision on where we want to go with it. The other thing we've been working on a lot or discussing a lot is multi-tenancy. There's been some work with the auth around multi-tenancy issues, including a meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, and we hope to have another meeting soon around that. We decided that everybody's interested in multi-tenancy needs to come up with their own definition of multi-tenancy, since it seems that everyone has a slightly different one. And once people actually know what they think multi-tenancy means, then we can try to arrive at a common agreement as to what multi-tenancy means across SIGs or even inside SIGs. So we hope to figure that out. We have a meeting later today where I hope we'll discuss that a little bit more and then move forward on what multi-tenancy actually means. Our current thinking is mostly along the lines of isolated users or groups of users of the cluster. There seems to be some agreement, although not total agreement, that a namespace seems like a good fit for the basic of tenancy. And at least a number of the members of the SIG are currently assuming that networking for each tenant is isolated from other tenants by default. But then, of course, you can also share some resources between tenants. So it's kind of a decoupled idea of networking from tenancy, because just because you are a tenant doesn't mean that you should not have access to shared resources based on, cluster administration or whatnot. So we're going to keep discussing tenancy, hopefully arrive at some conclusion about that fairly soon, and keep working with other SIGs around multi-tenancy issues. There are a couple of Kubernetes issues open on this where we're kind of putting ideas and thoughts and pieces of Kubernetes that we think would be affected by tenancy. And I can go dig those up for people if they want later.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
The notes when you finished. I know you have another meeting right after this, but at some point later today, it would be helpful.
Sure, I'll try to do that.
Thanks.
Jumping on to 1.5 work, some of the things we've identified or that are starting to heat up a little bit are there's been a lot of discussion in the last week about cloud providers and their interaction with network plugins. There have been some issues around cloud provider routes and how they interact with network plugins, as some network plugins don't necessarily need routes, but currently routes kind of gate node availability when you're using cloud provider. So we're trying to shake those out, and those probably should get done by 1.5 since it's fairly to fix that stuff up. We're also want to firm up how Kubernetes interacts with CNI plugins and how information gets passed from Kubernetes to those plugins. For example, host ports for containers is the main driver of that use case right now. We want to make sure that the interface between Kubernetes and CNI plugins does not grow some hugely Kubernetes specific stuff, so that CNI network plugins should be mainly generic and fairly agnostic, and could be used in other cases as well. But obviously, when you're working with Kubernetes, there's some information that network plugins need to know to be able to do the job. And so we're going to try to figure out how that should work without being too specific. Also, there's the KubeNet plugin, which is supposed to be a replacement for the Configure CBR0 and Flannel experimental overlay options that Kubelet has. And this KubeNet plugin is based on CNI, but is currently built into Kubelet. We want to move that to a real CNI plugin, and so some of the 1.5 work will be continuing to move that out into a real CNI plugin. And one of the reasons to do this is kind of as a proof that CNI is able to do what we want out of network plugins, and it will also help us shake out some of the parts of the Kubernetes interaction with CNI, as well as some of the problems with the CNI spec. And that's been going on for a little bit, but we hope to continue moving towards that. And after that's done, we hope to deprecate the Configure CBR0 and Flannel experimental overlay options. It turns out Flannel experimental overlay was actually removed this week, I believe. So yay, that's gone. I don't know if Configure CBR0 will actually get removed by 1.5, but we'll see. And also the new container runtime interface that has been in the works for a while is a pretty big change, and we're still trying to figure out how that affects network plugins and pod network setup flow. That's probably not necessarily a 1.5 item, but that's something we'll definitely keep tracking during the 1.5 cycle. And then there are a couple of bits left over from 1.5, or excuse me, 1.4, that there's still a little bit of work left to do. Tim Hawken had specifically mentioned the service proxy local node preference, which is where I believe it involves an annotation that you can put on the service that if there is an endpoint for that service running on the local node, the service proxy will direct traffic to that local endpoint as opposed to routing it to some other node in the cluster. That works for some specific cases, but Tim is working to fix that for the node port case for 1.5. And then I also mentioned network policy. We're going to make a decision pretty soon as to whether to push for beta or GA for 1.5 or whether to wait for 1.6. I think given some of the deadlines, maybe 1.6, but I'm still hopeful for 1.5. And then lastly, egress policy is something that's still very much under discussion. It's not going to make the cut for 1.5 and maybe not for 1.6 unless there's a champion. And egress policy would kind of be a complement to the pod ingress filtering. This would be about egress filtering, but there are some questions there around whether the use cases are more cluster administrator focused or whether they're actually app focused or app developer focused. So that is still something under heavy discussion. And with all of these, before I jump to any questions people have, if any of these topics sound interesting to you, definitely try to join our meetings. We'd love to talk. We'd love more ideas. And also a plea for reviewers for some of the network patches or PRs as well. That would be awesome.
And generally, reviewers don't have to be maintainers or vetted in any way. More eyes on reviews does help. So even if you can't commit with Into the Tree or you can't put an LGTM label on things, you can say, hey, I've reviewed it. Here are my comments. And that will help us immensely.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
Can I ask you a question?
Okay. Go, Joe.
All the stuff that you're talking about, is this going into core or is this being built as sort of separable APIs that are optional?
The most of the stuff that I'm talking about here, I believe, is core API. The parts that are not core API or not part of the core would be the actual network plugins themselves from third-party vendors that would be implementing network policy and things like that. But the network policy API itself and objects are part of core.
I would, I know it's a big thing, but I would love to entertain the thought exercise of what would it take to move these things out of core. And because this is, Kubernetes as a, SDN control plane is good, but, maybe that's not something that should be built into the core APIs. But I will take my answer offline. We can talk about that later. I just wanted to bring that up.
Sure. Yeah, one of my goals personally is to try to move as much networking specific code out of the components as possible and move that into APIs, or at least make APIs available that could then be used to implement these things outside of Kubernetes, whether that's third-party plugins or whether that's plugins that are part of the Kubernetes project that use those APIs but are not necessarily built into Kubelet or any of the other places. We had some discussions around network policy where we did start off as a third-party resource, just kind of to prove that. But we decided that having some consistency around the network operations and network policy was desirable, at least to the point that when you set up a cluster, what capabilities would be available and you could access those capabilities in a consistent manner. But I think in general, we do want to continue moving as much network-specific code and such out of the components as possible.
I think that it's a different discussion in terms of driving consistency, in terms of what is, the set of Kubernetes services that users should expect in a general purpose cluster is a different question from what should be core and what should not be core with respect to third-party resources. But it's, probably a longer discussion than we can fit in this meeting here.
Yep, fair enough. Let's keep bringing that up. I'm not sure where the appropriate venue for that is, but yeah, definitely.
I would say a starting point is the Thursday afternoon SIG networking conversations.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much, Dan. That's
No problem. And if you do have more questions, feel free to mail the SIG list as well.
Yes, because mail and chat and meetings and all the ways to contact one another, GitHub, etc.
Yep. All right, thanks. And I will drop off. Thanks, everybody.
Have fun at your next meeting, and thanks for making the space.
No problem.
So up next in our agenda is SIG storage. Saad is willing to give us an update.
Yeah, so 1.5 coding has started. To wrap up on what we did for 1.4, 1.4 we focused mostly on bug fixes from the big rewrite from 1.3. And we've shipped a new version of dynamic provisioning. It's moved into beta now. There was a blog post recently about what's new in that feature. For 1.5, it's a really short milestone. We've got 4 weeks of coding. We're focusing primarily on adding a bunch of testing into storage to avoid any major regressions in the future. Beyond that, we're focusing on designs. We're not actually going to be doing a lot of feature coding this milestone. We have snapshots in the works. It's a feature for creating backups, basically, an abstraction API. And Flex Volume plugin is something that's kind of been on the back burner. For the most part, Flex Volume plugin has been a way for people to do out-of-tree volume plugins. It has stagnated since 1.3. It doesn't mirror the internal API anymore. It doesn't do dynamic provisioning or the attacher detacher interface. We want to bring it more in line with what the internal volume plugins are capable of, but that requires careful design. So we're going to go over that during the 1.5 milestone. Other than that, keep driving forward on dynamic volume provisioning. We're thinking about making dynamic volume provisioning the default behavior for clusters starting in 1.5. We are at the minimum going to have basically default provisioners for AWS, GCE. But the question is whether we should make them the default behavior if somebody creates a persistent volume claim without an annotation should they, continue to do the existing behavior of matching a pool of existing PVs or automatically get auto provisioned. And so that's a big open design question. And that's pretty much it for 1.5.
Anybody have storage questions about 1.5 or 1.4? Make storage work transparently without trouble. That's pretty much the goal as far as I can tell. All right, thank you, Saad.
Mhm.
All right, Ihor, I think you're up next with process and features.
Yes, I am. So I have a brief update regarding the actual feature status for 1.5. So we have decided, as we have discussed it in Kubernetes PM and Kubernetes Dev mailing list, so the feature submission phrase is aligned for the next Monday. So October 10 is the last date when someone who would like to see his feature in 1.5 release has ability to submit it to us to review it and continue working on that. So if you'd like to see a feature in this release, please do that before this Monday.
And if I remember correctly, that's a very low bar. It's a paragraph of description and a checklist, right?
Yes. Yes. So everything, what should you do? Do you simply have to submit your issue to the features repo with a brief discussion of your feature, what you're going to do, and what this feature is about. And also, I'd like to ask you to paste a few words to that spreadsheet that I have prepared and presented on the last week meeting, where you may see everything about our existing features that are going to be added to this release.
Cool.
And starting from Monday, it's a good time for actively coding your features.
Yes, good thing to plan to do. Figure out your features first, then code them. All right, anyone have questions about the features repo or what the PM team has been working on? Wow, we are going to get through our agenda quickly. Okay, cool. Does anyone have any other specific topics? Actually, I know of two more topics, cherry picks. So Jessie Frizzell is our 1.4 point release czarina. So she is going to be our interface to the point releases on 1.4. So tell us more about 1.4.1.
Yeah, so we're going to build the release tomorrow. So if you can get in anything that you desperately need cherry picked today and ping me on it. And if I haven't commented on your cherry pick yet, that might be a problem, or if I haven't seen it. So maybe re-ping me if so, but I think that I've gone through all of them. But I want to make sure that nothing gets left out that's super important.
So the last day for cherry picks is today?
Yes.
Okay.
Today, yeah, make sure that they're in for tomorrow. Then I should change my note, which says cherry picks in by Friday. In today. Okay, excellent. Anyone have questions about this or what happens for the next point releases? Or the handoff, anything? Okay. Sounds like there's not. Caleb, are you on the Zoom chat today? Because you had said something about wanting to touch on owners.
I am.
Excellent. Tell me more about owners.
Yeah, so presented at the Contributor Experience Biweekly yesterday. We have been waiting for people to reply to their opt-in emails. Sorry about having to send out 2 rounds of those, but response has been overwhelmingly positive. We'll be updating the PR against Kubernetes, hopefully today with everyone's opt-in preferences. We are also testing the bot integration on Kubernetes/contrib. So that's also in progress. There have been no email sent out for that. So that's where that is, and hopefully we'll be able to get that PR merged in sometime early next week.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. And that has been work that has been long coming and is going to help us a ton. It does not, however, as I mentioned earlier, limit people's ability to review things. Even if you are not listed as a reviewer, a maintainer, an owner, an approver, having reviews from you is always helpful because we can establish and build and grow trust through seeing reviews from people who are not as well known in the community. So please do make reviews if you have opportunities and interests on particular topics. Okay, the next big topic is CLA changes. So as you've probably been seeing in pull requests, we are now running both the Google CLA bot and the Linux Foundation CLA bot in parallel. If you have issues, you can reach out to me or Anirudh, thank you. I was only getting his login, Anirudh, and we will help either connect you to the Cloud Native Compute Foundation if we need to do background fixing on that, or we will try to figure out why it's not working properly. So both of them are running in parallel for a bit. And we're pretty close to having all the corporate CLAs signed, which is awesome. But each of you who is not under a corporate CLA needs to sign an individual CLA. Any of you who is under a corporate CLA will still need to make a Linux Foundation ID and have that connected to the corporate CLA. So there is a bit of process around this. That's why we're running two of them in parallel for a while, so we don't, potentially stop updates and stop pull requests in the short term. So it's happening, we're moving, and very soon we'll be free of the Google CLA yoke. Okay, I didn't say that aloud. Anyway, that covers the CLA changes, owner updates. There is a 1.4 retrospective tomorrow. So as we did with 1.2 and 1.3, we made a specific retrospective time, and Jason Singer DeMars is going to lead that tomorrow, 10 a.m. and it will be on this same Zoom channel. I don't know what to call this, Zoom account. And most of you, or all of you who are on this meeting, should have an invite for it if you wish to attend. If you can't attend, or even if you plan to attend, please take a look at the document in the notes here and add your retrospective thoughts ahead of time, because that way we can have more discussion and less note generating time during the 1 hour tomorrow. Last time after 1.3, we opted to do 2 1-hour retrospectives because we had so much to discuss, but I think also in part because we didn't spend the time up front to get our comments in. So if you can spend a little bit of time up front to get comments in, and then we will be able to get through this in 1 hour and all of us get an hour of our lives back. There's also in the notices section a note that tomorrow there is a webinar called DevOps in the Age of Docker and Kubernetes, and I have to say Aprenda is a Twitter marketing machine for Kubernetes, so thank you, Aprenda. It is astonishing the amount of traffic that they have generated around this webinar, and that it's going to be very well attended. And it is with Jean Kim, myself, and Sinclair from Aprenda. So it's going to be exciting either way. I'm sure we will. It's a little bit early for the West Coast, but we'll figure it out. The URL, if you're curious, is also in the notes. Does anyone else have any other notices or things that they want to mention? Because we did run a little quick through this one, which is fine. I have no reason that we should run out the clock. No more topics? Going once? Going twice? Happy Thursday. Have a great day, and we will see you on the retrospective tomorrow if you are interested, or we will see you digitally, in the ether as we always do. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.